Dear Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, for all of our blessings, for the fellowship we've been able to enjoy with our brothers and sisters, for the good, that blessing of coming together and studying, Lord, and fellowship. I pray, Lord, that you'll be in the midst of us as we come together to worship you and to learn of you. And I pray that in understanding these histories, we might get a sense of who and what you are, of your love for us, and of the degree of trust we can place in you in every area of our lives. I pray, Lord, that you will bless this time together in Jesus' name. Amen. Hello again. So this morning, we concluded our thoughts with Pyrrhus, and then when we looked who Pyrrhus was as a symbol, we went to Daniel chapter 2 and we saw that head of gold could represent both the king as well as the kingdom. So when it comes to the king of the south, it can be a person or it can be a nation, as a state. So when it comes to Pyrrhus, the king of the south in this history, and Epirus and Tarentum, these symbols, they can represent people or nations, states. Pyrrhus, therefore, that history we laid out in two parts. This is the history of Pyrrhus in Macedonia and his history in Italy. When we understand that he can represent a king and a kingdom, we understand in this, in one context, he represents Putin, but also that he can represent the king of the south during its whole existence. So if this is the history of Pyrrhus, it's the history of the king of the south in two separate dispensations, in an Alpha history and an Omega history, showing the beginning and the end. From that understanding, we traced the history of Epirus as a country, and we understood that Pyrrhus was the 10th. He was the 10th from the first, and it's the beginning that typifies the end. So if we understand that the king of the south as a person at the end of the world is Vladimir Putin, and we understand that he's a 10th from Stalin then typifies Vladimir Putin. Alpha and Omega. You have the history of the USSR and the history of Russia today. You have the history of Stalin and the history of Vladimir Putin. This is nothing new to us. We're well acquainted with saying Millerites and 144,000. It's not a new concept to see an Alpha and Omega history with the beginning, in this case the Millerites, typifying the end, or the 144,000. It's just this time we're using that same principle to understand the king of the south at the end of the world. It's by the testimony of two or three that a thing is established. So we must see another testimony in our history to understand the end of the world. In this case, if we're going to understand what World War III looks like at the end of the world, then it's already been seen in World War II. After making those conclusions, we then traced the history of the King of the South, the history of the Soviet Union and then Russia, not from when it's born in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution, but from when it becomes involved in world affairs. First in the Spanish civil war that was a proxy war in Europe between fascism, which now composed Germany under Hitler and Italy under Mussolini, versus a communist Soviet Union. So this interaction began with a proxy war that ended on the 1st of April 1939. Then you saw these two ideological enemies come out of a proxy war and go into an alliance, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. This shocked the world and was called the Midnight of the Century, the pact being signed shortly after midnight. Then you see this alliance. The purpose of this alliance was for the invasion of Poland. Hitler needed this alliance if he was going to take on the threefold Allied powers. This begins war in the West. Then there is a division of Eastern Europe between Germany and Russia, divisions of spheres of influence. Then in August 1940, Russia suspends trade to Germany. Their relationship begins to sour, and the trade agreements that were signed are halted until they are drawn up again. There was tension over the spheres of influence, and Stalin was a little worried that Hitler was doing too well in this war. The pact is officially broken in 1941 on the 22nd of June when Hitler launches his invasion of the Soviet Union. In this time period in 1941, the Holocaust really began years before, but this is when it turns really into genocide with the invention of the gas chambers and the horrific persecution in that time period. This takes us to 1945. Russia, now an enemy of Germany, naturally joins the Allies, those three Allied forces, and Germany is defeated by the USA and the USSR, divided between East and West. This sparks a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union that extends until 1989 to 1991. 1989, the beginning of that fall, and 1991, its completion. And the King of the South lost all of their territory except for the borders of Russia. It just kept its original country. The lines have had to be drawn up for ease of for time, but if you could ignore this middle history and remember Pyrrhus in his beginning campaign in Macedonia, we can trace, you can see the same 10-year period. Then this beginning, Demetrius frees Athens from a dictator, and then the alliance between Pyrrhus and Demetrius. So an alliance between Germany, between Hitler and Stalin. Now you see an alliance between Pyrrhus and Demetrius. And this alliance is then tested when they face a threefold enemy, where Pyrrhus supports Demetrius in a war with three powers. And here, Stalin supported Germany in a war with three powers. Then the relationship begins to sour until it's finally fully broken. And then you see Pyrrhus joins the Allies, Russia joins the Allies, Germany or Demetrius is defeated by these twofold powers and divided into East and West. The problem for both Demetrius and Germany was that they both were facing a war on two fronts. This sparks a Cold War between those two victors. Pyrrhus lost all but Epirus, and the Soviet Union lost all but the borders of Russia, both due to the tactics of a Cold War. Undermining the government and cutting off their supplies. If we can ignore this board for a second and just pick up where we left off. We finished World War II that extended into the Cold War. We looked at that history, and it took us to 1989.
Yeah.
1989 to 91.
Yeah.
Now I want to plot the modern history, what we do know of what happens with Russia in its final phase. 1989 to 91 was the fall of the Soviet Union, losing all but the borders of Russia. At the same time, in a different scene, in a different way, you see the war has not ended, but it's just changed in appearance. And this is where you see the behaviour in Italy. Thurii changed its allegiance from its relative Tarentum, its traditional authority, to that of Rome. 1989 to 91, you see those Soviet satellite states. Poland, Ukraine, all of those eastern countries changed their allegiance from the Soviet Union, from Russia, to the United States or the West. So Tarentum had an ancient treaty with Rome. Rome had agreed that they would not extend into that area that they extended into, that they wouldn't interfere with that area of the south of Italy that Tarentum had authority over. They had an ancient treaty that promised that. I'd like us to consider what the United States agreed to as far as Eastern Europe goes. At the end of the Cold War, there was these conferences that brought together this new threefold alliance. It brought together Churchill from England and Hitler from the Soviet Union and Roosevelt from the United States. Sorry, it's Stalin. So Stalin, Roosevelt and Churchill coming together, United States, Britain and the Soviet Union, to decide what the world would look like after World War II was finished. One of these conferences they met at was the Conference of Yalta, known as the Yalta Conference. These three wartime allies wanted to establish a stable European arrangement so that they could make sure that World War II didn't turn into World War III, that it wouldn't continue to be this fight over division of territory. Roosevelt and Churchill, this is the leaders of Britain and Russia, accepted the idea at that conference that the Soviet Union and Stalin would have a legitimate reason to have a sphere of influence over Eastern Europe. They understood that that Eastern Europe was like this buffer zone. It was what protected the borders of Russia. So right against your borders, you want to have allies. You want to have people that have your back, that are supporting you. So they understood that the Soviet Union would want some type of alliance along its borders to keep its borders safe. With that in mind, Churchill suggested that they draw up a mathematical formula for post-war predominance in Eastern Europe. He suggested that the Soviet Union accept 90% predominance in Romania, 75% in Bulgaria, 50% in Hungary and Yugoslavia, and 10% in Greece. In each of these countries, according to Churchill's proposal, Britain and its friends would enjoy the influence that was left. Stalin accepted this deal on the spot. It was a good deal for the Soviet Union. What it said was that those eastern countries would come under the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union. But this was a very vague agreement. And it's believed that Churchill and Roosevelt never believed this would be a permanent arrangement. Stalin was supposed to help those countries get back on their feet and elect their own governments and be somewhat independent. They didn't expect the case of the fall of what they called the Iron Curtain, where Stalin just took control over all of them. Putin tells another story. For Vladimir Putin, Russia has been wronged. He claims that the United States failed to uphold a promise made during the fall of the Soviet Union in the middle of that period in 1990. The United States has protested and said that they never struck a deal, but there is evidence from the US archives that a deal was struck. And it's believed that the Soviet Union was promised that if they did their part in scaling back the Cold War and stepping back, that the United States will not allow NATO to extend any further past Germany. NATO was never to go anywhere east past Germany, and that was promised the Soviet Union. That's something Vladimir Putin still speaks about, how Russia was wronged because they've just kept extending NATO and extending NATO. And this causes the Soviet Union, now Russia, to feel somewhat unsafe, fairly legitimately so. NATO was created at the end of World War II. NATO was created to try and contain communism and the Soviet Union. So as the United States has pushed this NATO alliance further east and further east, it is a direct attempt to contain Russia. NATO? I can't remember what NATO stands for. It's the alliance of countries that were formed to close allies of the United States that were allied pretty much against the Soviet Union. So in this history, actually in 1949, the Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons. This escalated the Cold War to such a degree that the United States aided in the forming of the NATO alliance, the alliance of countries that were opposed to the Soviet Union and that could be relied upon to defend you if the Soviet Union was to invade one of those countries. In response to this forming of NATO, the USSR decided they would form their own alliance of countries, and they called this Comecon. So what you had over this Cold War period was not just the United States versus the USSR, but all these other countries became involved, to where you had an alliance of countries backing the USA to an alliance of countries backing the USSR. Russia believed that an understanding of their authority over the eastern countries has applied since the Yalta Conference. This is an argument that Vladimir Putin has made before in public, particularly also including the verbal agreement of 1990 about not expanding the NATO alliance eastward. But the West has not honoured this understanding. So 1989 to 1991, the Soviet satellite states changes its allegiance to the West, but one particular country does that again, and this is the Ukraine. In 1991, Ukraine split from the Soviet Union, and in 2014, they tried to join NATO. What happened between these years is that inside Ukraine you had two factions, and we explained up here the two factions. There are the aristocrats and the Democrats. What you had inside Ukraine was two factions. One side wanted to ally with Russia because Russia was much more their relatives. Russia had always had authority over them before. So aristocrats wanted Rome. The Democrats wanted Tarentum. And one political faction inside the Ukraine wanted to come under the West, join NATO, and really ally with the United States. This other faction wanted to ally with Russia. And there's some going forth, back and forth in this history from 2000, it's like 2007. In that history, for quite some years, these two factions are fighting it out. There was corruption, there was rigged elections, some presidents were stood down, some party members sent to jail. Really quite a lot of internal unrest as this struggle between allying between the West and allying with Russia. But this tussle, back and forth tussle, came to a head when Viktor Yanukovych came to power. Viktor Yanukovych is an interesting character. Viktor Yanukovych had tried to be elected president of the Ukraine before, until it was proven that he had engaged in corruption and election fraud. And because of that, his victory was taken away from him. He was known to be very pro-Russian and an ally of Vladimir Putin. He decided to make another attempt on power. So what he did was he rebranded himself. He remade himself in the eyes of the people. And he put on this pretense that he was supportive of an alliance with the West, that he would consider allying with the United States and joining NATO. He spoke Russian normally, but during that election process, he spoke Ukrainian and appealed to those who wanted to ally with the West, that he would be on their side. To aid him, to help him to remodel himself, to pretend he was something that he wasn't in the eyes of the people, Russia recommended a particular man to really run his election campaign for him. That man was Paul Manafort, an American consultant and lobbyist. He had a lobbying firm where foreign governments would pay him to lobby Washington to make decisions that were favorable to them. Paul Manafort, if you read what his lobbying firm, the people they worked with, he preferred to work with dictatorships. He worked with people who undertook coups, who persecuted and killed their own people, some of them warlords. You know that when you have a rich American lobbyist in a suit who's getting paid by arms dealers, that there's something going wrong. And Paul Manafort owed Russian billionaires, Russian oligarchs, a lot of money. So Russia really had things that they could use against him. And he really has worked in the favor of Russia through much of what he's done. It's Russia that went to Viktor Yanukovych and said, we would suggest that if you want to rebrand yourself and be elected, that Paul Manafort runs your campaign. And Paul Manafort then came in and ran Viktor Yanukovych's campaign and helped him win victory, which he did then win that election and become president of the Ukraine. Paul Manafort next comes into our vision when he runs a very different campaign. He becomes Donald Trump's campaign manager. But we first see him working in the Ukraine for a pro-Russian member. As soon as Viktor Yanukovych wins the election in the Ukraine, in his speech the night he wins the election, he gets up to give his victory speech and he's no longer speaking Ukrainian. He's instantly returned to speaking Russian. Now he only speaks Russian. He pulls back, he refuses to join NATO, he refuses to work with the West, and he comes out quite strong. He's scrapping any plan to ally with the West. He's taking a huge deal with Russia, with oil, and pretty much takes a whole direction of Ukraine from that westward view to being, again, totally under Russia. This sparks what you might have heard of as the Euromaidan protests. Euromaidan protests were huge protests in Europe that began in 2013. November of 2013, there was a small protest in Independence Square in the Ukraine calling for integration with the European Union. On the 21st, the same day as this protest, Yanukovych abruptly changed his mind on an agreement he was meant to go in with the European Union, deciding instead that he's going to strengthen Ukraine's ties with Russia. November 30, a group of student protesters were attacked by police, leading to several injuries, and the protest then became a national movement. By December 8, the numbers of protesters swelled to 1 million people. These protesters continued to be attacked by police under Yanukovych's order. Violence escalated in January of 2014 when Yanukovych signed anti-protest laws. Now these people were forbidden to protest. Because of this, demonstrators began to occupy administration buildings in at least 10 regions. The country's lawmakers appealed those anti-protest laws by show of hands with no debate. Yanukovych then saw he was in danger and tried to reshape his government with more opposition members, but this attempt was refused. On the 28th of January, his prime minister resigned, and in February, Ukraine was on the brink of a civil war. 77 people had been killed in the Euromaidan protests, and what began to come out was huge evidences of corruption in by his government. He's somebody who, in his salary as president of the Ukraine, never exceeded $2,000 a month. So $24,000 a year was his salary, which made people wonder how he established a net worth of $12 billion, held in Switzerland, Austria and Liechtenstein. So his accounts were frozen and a money laundering investigation was launched. By this stage, the corruption is well known. Interpol issued a red notice for him now. Pretty much countries wide are calling for his arrest, because they understand now that he's embezzled that $12 billion from the economy of his own country, from Ukraine's economy. Going into his home estate, when protesters finally broke in, they saw what was released was his expenses for his mansion, $100,000 for each chandelier set of lights. So each set of lights in each of his rooms, $100,000. A crowned copper roof. He had in his estate a private zoo, an underground shooting range, an 18-hole golf course built on his property. He had expended $800 on medical treatment for his fish, over $14,000 on tablecloths, $42 million just for light fixtures. And what they also found were files that he'd had built on all of his perceived enemies and members of the media. So he'd also been, at the cost of over nearly $6 million, he'd also been tracking the media and all of his enemies. So these suggestions of corruption were more than abundantly proven. Add to that the threatening, attacking and torturing of the protesters, the intimidation of voters, the attacking of election officials, all under his personal command. So, as these protests escalate, he flees the Ukraine, and where does he flee to? Russia. Russia's where he's safe, and he's stayed in Russia under Russian protection ever since. On the 26th of February 2014, the Russian media company RBC reported Yanukovych's presence in Moscow. And the next day, they announced that Yanukovych had asked the Russian authorities, the Russian government, to guarantee his personal security inside Russia, and also to help him get his country back. Yanukovych asked the Russian military to intervene in Ukraine to restore law and order, and on that pretext in 2014, Russia invades the Ukraine. So inside the Ukraine, you see these two factions are at war. And we've discussed the ones that the people, that 1 million protesters that came to the streets wanting alliances with the West, NATO and the United States. But there's also a portion of the Ukraine, the Crimea, that speaks Russian, that didn't mind allying with Russia. So it is a very split country. First of all, in 1991, they choose the West over Russia, but then in 2014 again, they choose the people, expel Yanukovych. They bring in a government that wants to ally to the West, and in response to this, Russia invades the Ukraine. If we can, I think on some of you that are able to download it, or we have it on a hard drive that we can share, is documentaries that give some insight into the thinking of Vladimir Putin. They might make what we discuss today clearer. If you understand some of that history, maybe you already understand it without it, but there's still good videos to watch. It goes into why he behaves the way he does. In 1991, he was a KGB operative in Dresden, Germany. Sitting inside a compound, he saw the people take to the streets in mass protests, threatening to break down into this KGB office and really threaten the safety of any Russian they found. These were angry protesters. So, seeing that, he goes out and faces the mob. By this stage, a mob has gathered around the KGB building in Dresden, Germany, and a young Vladimir Putin, just a low-level operative, goes out to the gates and says, "We have guns on the inside. If you come inside this compound, we will shoot all of you." They had no such thing. He's bluffing. He's just trying to keep the protesters from attacking the building. He then goes down into the basement and burns every piece of paper he can find. He was a scared young man. So in his thinking, he goes through that fall of the Soviet Union, and he sees what people taking to the streets can do and what a protest can do. He's someone who's very much scared of his own people. He has called the fall of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical disaster of the 20th century. So forget the Holocaust, World War I or World War II. He says that the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical disaster of that whole century. So these were a couple of painful years for Putin as he watched his country fall apart. And how it fell apart was from the inside, its people turning on its government. In 2011, I would like, if we have time, to discuss more of 2011. But in 2011, he announces that he's coming back to power. As we said, he had co-ruled for that 4-year term with Medvedev. And in 2011, he says that he's going to come back as president. This sparks the greatest protests inside Russia that had happened since the fall of the Soviet Union. When Vladimir Putin says he's coming back in 2011, the people know he's coming back as a dictator, and they take to the streets for the first time to the same extent as they'd taken to the streets in 1991 to bring about the fall of the Soviet Union. So he understands that his own people turning on him are a threat to his power. Beginning in 2011, though, in his mindset, he then begins to protect himself from this. And I would suggest this is part of his military preparation. He establishes in 2016 a personal military guard. What he then established was what is known as the National Guard. These are some of the most brutal, hardened soldiers he could find that quickly swelled into an army of about 400,000 troops. This National Guard is separate to the army, and it's for Vladimir Putin's personal protection. Its commanding general was his personal bodyguard from way back in 1998, from before he was president. Now the National Guard has the right to arrest anyone without a judicial order, to shoot anyone without warning, to disband any organisation considered dangerous to Vladimir Putin or Russia's national security. And it's known for its brutality. This National Guard is set up to protect his dictatorship from his own people. These are the people that if the army side with the people and turn on him, he has a 400,000 bodyguards, you should say, the toughest men in the Russian military. It's known as his Praetorian Guard. I believe it was the Caesars that had a type of Praetorian Guard, and he has established his own. This is the beginning up here of Pyrrhus's military preparation, and he's preparing his own people and his own city for war with Rome. I would suggest in 2016 Vladimir Putin is doing the same thing. He's strengthening his hold on his own country. Pyrrhus was strengthening his hold in Tarentum. He came into Tarentum as a dictator. And then we have already considered the last of these three battles. We understand that there are three battles between the king of the north and the king of the south. The last one we'd already established as Panium. This is when Russia is defeated by the USA. We'd considered 273 as being a waymark where the United Nations recognises Rome as a world power. And then we'd considered 272 BC and Sunday Law, when Rome returns as a flood. Just to consider these two battles before it, if we work backwards, we understand this is Raphia. And if we're going to consider the relationship between internal and external events, 2014 is a waymark on our reform line. 2016 is a waymark on our reform line. Raphia, Panium, Sunday Law, each one is a waymark on our reform line. When there is an internal waymark, there is an external corresponding event. And I would suggest this first battle we're in the middle of now, it lines up with our loud cry message. This is the application of the Amiga histories of the Amiga history of Pyrrhus overlaid on top of our history. We'd already understood 1989 to 91 as waymarks. We'd understood 2014, Raphia, Panium and Sunday Law. But we begin to have a bit more of an insight into these 2 years, 2016 and 2018. And these are the years that I'm hoping we can cover a little bit more of, in understanding the external events and also in understanding how they impact our reform lines when we bring in 2 new waymarks. If you consider 2016 as this ramp up of his war effort, if you go through just in October alone what Vladimir Putin did, how he established air bases, he brought all of his nuclear capable missiles to the borders of Europe, right against the borders of the EU, and pointed them west. All through the year of 2016, he is building up his country for war. I would suggest It's not a hot war. But we're going to discuss that more shortly. So if we understand, just before I rub out these names, Viktor Yanukovych, President of Ukraine, incredibly corrupt man allied to Vladimir Putin, Russia, and those billionaire oligarchs. If you can try and remember the name Paul Manafort. We also have documentaries on Donald Trump and on his rise to power and the role Paul Manafort played in having Trump elected. Paul Manafort already tied in with Vladimir Putin. Paul Manafort is now more than under investigation, he's under arrest, and he is being charged with some fairly serious crimes. So if, as we suggested, we understand that Pyrrhus equals Vladimir Putin, but that Putin also equals Stalin. And if A equals B and B equals C, if A is equal to B and B is equal to C, you know that A and the C are the same. So if Pyrrhus is Putin and Putin is Stalin, Pyrrhus is also Stalin. But I would suggest in his alpha history. So what that then enables us to do is the same thing we've been doing for a long time with this movement. We understand that we have the beginning of modern Israel, the end of modern Israel. We cut them and overlay them, beginning of ancient and end of ancient Israel, the beginning of modern Israel, the end of modern Israel. We cut all 4 lines and can overlay them. So to save time, I've already laid out that process. What we have is Pyrrhus in his alpha history. This is Pyrrhus in Macedonia. The alpha. And then we have his final history. Pyrrhus in Italy. The Omega. And then when it comes to the King of the South, we have the King of the South, World War II, and the Cold War. I would suggest that's our alpha history to understand the King of the South in its Omega phase, which is World War III. So we can cut our lines and overlay them, and where we cut them is where we see that change of scene from Macedonia to Italy. One thing that we need to consider that may at first seem to complicate this process is that when we overlay the histories of Alpha and Omega, you can't drop everything down perfectly. So just when we consider our battles, if we go over to this waymark here, when it comes to Sunday law, is the defeat against the King of the South partial or complete? It's total victory. But when it came to 1989 to 1991, was that a partial or a total victory? Partial. And when it came to 272 BC, this is Pyrrhus. Was that total or complete? Total. He died and Tarentum fell. But back up here in 285, he still had the borders of his own country. This was only a partial defeat of Pyrrhus. Then when we go back to this battle, who wins in this battle? Pyrrhus versus Demetrius. The king of the south, Pyrrhus. Who wins in this battle? The king of the north, Rome. 1945, who wins? Is this Germany or the Soviet Union? The king of the south. And when it comes to Panium, we know that the victor there is the king of the north. 289 to 288 BC, who won? Demetrius or Pyrrhus? Pyrrhus was not able to defend his own country. King of the north. Demetrius ravaged Epirus without any opposition. 279, who wins? Pyrrhus. 1941, Operation Barbarossa. They just devastated Russia. And then down when it comes to the Battle of Raphia, we know that is a victory for the King of the South, for Russia. And we step back into this battle that we're considering now. Pyrrhus invades Thessaly. Was this a victory for Pyrrhus or for Demetrius? Demetrius. There isn't much of a history on that, except we know that Demetrius just drove him back very easily. The Battle of Heraclea, who wins?
King of the South.
King of the South, Pyrrhus. August of 1940, this one gets a little bit more confusing. It's to do with trade. But out of these new trade agreements, it by far favoured Germany. And I would suggest that it's the King of the South we see win this smaller battle. Heraclea, half the size of Asculum. I would suggest it's a smaller battle, half the size, smaller than what we would expect to see at Raphia. So when we consider Alpha and Omega histories, we have to make some difference between those two histories, but it doesn't prevent us from dropping those things down and learning from them. When we consider Millerite history and our history, Millerite history ended in October 22, 1844, and it ended in a disappointment. When we took that to the counterfeit, that was 1945. This was where the King of the South won, and for the papacy, this was a disappointment. But 1945 is the Battle of Panium, and where the South wins here, the North wins here. So is Panium a disappointment for the King of the South? Sorry, for the King of the North. Is Panium a disappointment for the papacy? No. So what is a disappointment in a history of failure is not a disappointment in a history of success. This is where it also starts having implications for God's people. First, in an Alpha history. Why is it an Alpha history? Why is it not an Omega history? If it's an Alpha history, somewhere it went wrong, because otherwise you wouldn't need an Omega history. Ellen White says Jesus would have come back years ago. If everything had have gone right in that history, there would be no Omega. If they had have killed the King of the South here, there would be no history in our day. So that isn't a new concept, that there are differences between the beginning and the end. If we can then consider some implications of these other two lines, we've considered Pyrrhus in Italy, so we've lined up our two Omega histories, our two end-time histories. But then if we also consider our beginning histories, you know you can mark 10 years prior to the time of the end. And we already have understood in this movement for some time that 1979 was a warning for the Adventist Church that they were meant to see. In 1979, the Pope is standing at the White House as their new friend. And it's also the beginning of a proxy war. In this history, you see a proxy war in Afghanistan between the King of the North, or between the United States and the Soviet Union. This ends in the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989. At that point, we think the Soviet Union, we think the King of the South is dead, that it's no longer a problem. Where do we see it resurface? What brings it back into the politics of really to interfering in world affairs again? I would suggest that that's 2014. We've already placed that waymark. We can do that because of the Ukraine. And what Donald Trump is currently being investigated for is a collusion. Did we read that word this morning? In 1989, the Soviet Union admitted that there was a collusion between Stalin's Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. And what Donald Trump is being investigated for, that prior to his election, there was collusion between Russia and his campaign team. 2014, you see an alliance between Russia and Donald Trump. Two ideological enemies. Why are they going into an alliance in 2014? I would suggest it's because there's a battle coming up. This battle they went into as allies, and this battle was the three levels of the US government. There's the executive branch, the president, then there's the judicial branch, and the legislative branch. These three branches were taken on by Donald Trump, backed by Vladimir Putin or Russia. Germany invaded Poland, took it quickly, and then he faces a prolonged war on the Western Front to have control over those other countries. Donald Trump won that executive branch in a day. He became president. Now when we watch the news and we watch him attack NATO and their allies, he attacks the CIA, the FBI, he attacks Congress, he attacks the media, he attacks everyone, because this is war on the Western Front. He's facing a battle with the judicial and the legislative branches. But he's been doing this with one ally, and that was Vladimir Putin. Without Putin's help, he would not have won that election. We want to look a little bit more into what happened in that election. Then I would suggest that at our loud cry there is a battle between the King of the North and the King of the South, a souring of their relationship about half the size of raffia. What caused tension to bring this about was a division over spheres of influence. I don't think it's a coincidence that Donald Trump just a few days ago refused to meet with Vladimir Putin because Putin had again attacked the Ukraine. There is tension coming into their alliance over Ukraine, over their spheres of influence. And I would suggest that's one of the things we should at the moment be keeping our eye on. We're going to go through that history a little bit more. And we understand that out of this battle, this is a victory for Russia. We should expect Vladimir Putin to come out on top in that battle. Then we see raffia. The end of November of 2019, the Battle of Raffia. The Battle of Panium. and Sunday law. Again, a victory for the king of the south at the Battle of Raphia. He's defeated at Panium, but it's a progressive fall until Sunday law. If you consider the Operation Barbarossa, which we place over Raphia in the 22nd of June 1941, it's considered to be, in effect, the largest and most powerful invasion force known in human history. German forces made significant advances early on, and by mid-July they were 200 miles from Moscow. They shattered the original Soviet army in the first beginning stages of that war. So if we can consider this history, one thing I'd like us to note is that we have these three battles, and this is where we can start seeing making some interesting applications. When we take all of this history material down and overlay it over our reform line, we see that Panium is a battle, as is Raphia, as is our current, what we're about to see. But what is 2016? It's also a battle. It's the Battle of Ipsus. It's the invasion of Poland. So instead of having two battles that we've had since 2016, we've understood Raphia and Panium as the two battles between the king of the north and the king of the south. Now we see that there are in fact four battles. But the first one they go into as allies. They're fighting against a common threefold enemy in the first battle. This one they go in as allies until their relationship sours and they turn on each other and go in as enemies. Go at it as enemies. This first battle, the Battle of Ipsus. What decided the Battle of Ipsus? What decided that victory? Elephants. What decided the Battle of Heraclea? What about Asculum and Beneventum? It's the same consistent mode of warfare. Warfare has changed significantly over the last century. Since World War II, it has not been the same since World War II between superpowers. If we consider how nations considered war at the beginning of World War I, people wanted to go to war. In fact, they actually began conscription because under conscription they had less people than when they just allowed the men to come forward. So many men wanted to fight that when they brought in conscription there were less numbers than before. Because people had a glorious idea of war, and they thought it would be fast, and they would come home with tales of valor and how they'd been brave and medals, and that they'd saved their country and they'd be loved by their country, that their country would be established as an empire. And instead World War I turned out very, very different. And then you have World War II and the anger that really stemmed from World War I. It's considered to be one war in two phases. It was a war with a temporary ceasefire. But you consider World War I and World War II as the same war with a break in the middle. And that same anger carried into World War II, where you saw tens of millions of people die. Then you have a global superpower with nuclear weapons. In fact, then you start having two global superpowers with nuclear weapons. And war changes from that point on. Now to defeat your enemy, it's gone about in a different way. Since 1945, war between superpowers has not been the same. So, I would suggest that we can treat, as we kind of looked at that when we considered the counterfeit, that we can see World War III kind of like we understand the third angel's message. So you can see World War III in 1945. You can see it beginning in 2016, and you can see it in 1989. You can see it in different ways. Just as an added thought, but I think an important one to grasp, the idea of World War II as teaching us about World War III brings us to a kind of a different, something different to consider that I think is significant. And it brings in the idea that these aren't necessarily battles. Was 1989 a battle? Not really. It looks different. So what you now have is key points in a much larger war. From 2016 forward, what began was war on the Western Front. We know that out of this history, the United States falls, that it becomes this dictatorship under Donald Trump. And I don't think that is something that happens so easily. That is also part of this whole battle that we're seeing. First of all, there is a Western Front. What we see at Raffia is just the Eastern Front. Germany faced war on two fronts, on the west and on the east. 2016 marks the beginning of war on the Western Front with the election of Donald Trump. So when you see him attacking NATO and attacking his allies, putting down other countries, criticizing Germany and any democracy he can find and lifting up the world's dictators, that's war on the Western Front. So what does the war on the Eastern Front look like? It looks the same as war on the Western Front. These fronts looked the same. So when we also consider this history, it's not battle, space, battle, space, battle, space, battle. This whole period is warfare. There's many battles in World War II. So when we turn on the news and we see Donald Trump making another antagonistic jab at who were the United States allies, or against Congress and against his own branches of government, we're seeing this warfare in action. And this Eastern Front isn't just a story of two battles, it's war all the way through. And it's out of this war that not only sees the United States end up with a dictatorship like that of Nazi Germany, you also see, as we see in 273 and as we saw in World War II, the resurrection of the papacy, healing of the deadly wound. So if we want to understand what our future looks like, if we want to understand Raffia and Panium, we need to go backwards. We need to understand 2016 and what that battle looked like. So to spend a little bit of time on that, we'll begin that process. We will begin that process. If I can find my notes. 2016 as a year, it was the year that I was coming into the movement. And I was fascinated by the external events I was seeing. I remember the day that Donald Trump was elected. And I remember I was home alone that day. It had been a strange day for various reasons. But I was home alone and I was standing in front of a television and I was watching a map of the United States as each state turned blue for Hillary Clinton, or red for Donald Trump, and each state just pop up red, red. It just turned into this sea of red. And it was hard to shake the feeling that the world as we knew it had changed and would never be the same again. What we saw in 2016 in those earlier months was some really strange behaviour. And that behaviour, that strife really existed mostly on the platform of the internet. How Russia supported Donald Trump was on the platform of the internet. And how Donald Trump ran his campaign was through the internet. So what we want to understand is the internet in 2016 and what happened. To do that, we're going to start back at our time of the end. To understand what 2016 looks like. Now, I'm not someone that has a decent working knowledge of technology or computers. It would be better if my sister was to look into those things or teach them, or just about anyone other than me. I'm really bad at that. But I found the research interesting, and when you have a good source, you know you can trust. It has been educational. But there are some things that are unshakable. 1989 was a huge year. And one of those things that shows you that this is unshakable, that it has to have implications for our time, was that in 1989, our time of the end, there was a very important invention. This was the invention of the World Wide Web. We can think back in thousands of years ago. We've had the Iron Age and the Stone Age and the Bronze Age. What we have been in for some time, and what really took off in 1989 is what is called the Information Age. Back in the Bronze Age, bronze then became something they used as their weapons of war. In the Stone Age, they used stones, or the Iron Age, they used iron. We're now existing in the Information Age. It sounds much more glamorous or better than it is, but it turns into a very ugly mode of warfare. Very ugly weapons. Information prior to 1989 was difficult to share. The internet existed. It was actually invented, the internet, in 1969. Something known as ARPANET. We'll talk about that. So prior to 1969, you pretty much had all these huge computers that existed like pocket calculators. And they were independent to each other. They weren't connected. Each computer could be used for its own thing. And one of the reasons why they were difficult to connect is because each computer was different. It kind of spoke a different language. What happened in 1969 is the US military began to be able to link computers. Now it linked them all together so that one computer could communicate with a computer so many states away. And 1969 then marks the beginning of the internet. But there were still serious problems. They still didn't have one language. It was still very difficult to place information on them and then to have that information accessed on a different computer. This is what the World Wide Web was invented to do. The internet prior to this invention, it lacked the ability to format, store, locate, and then retrieve information. This is an article written by Time magazine in 2009, and what they put out in 2009 was a book that laid out the most significant events of 1989. They recognised it as a turning point year, one of the most significant years of the last at least half century. It was the 20-year anniversary. So Time magazine put out this book, and in this book they discussed this invention of the World Wide Web by a man known as Tim Berners-Lee. He wrote in 1989 a paper, scientific paper, titled Information Management. A proposal. What he's essentially proposing is that there's a different way to manage information on the internet, and that they can solve these problems of disseminating and accessing information by putting all these computers into one language. He wrote HTTP, HTML, pretty much the building blocks of the World Wide Web. This enabled there to be web pages. So the internet is a worldwide network of computers that are linked together by telephones, but the web runs on top of that, much like an application to allow information to be shared between these different computers. 1989, he invents the World Wide Web. 1990, he writes the first web browser. So when you open up your computer and you look, for example, on Wikipedia, that page is a web browser. I think. 1990, the first web browser. He's pretty much developing what back in 1989 was just a proposal, a suggestion. This is its invention. 1989, it's a proposal. 1990, he starts to build these web engines, and in 1991, it's released. He releases web browsers. And first he releases it to corporations and then to the general public. It is said that the World Wide Web was central to the development of the information age. It's the main tool that billions of people use to interact with each other on the internet. This really had implications in many different ways. For one example, when the government is investigating someone, they'd for some time been able to access their phone records. They could understand who you'd called on your mobile. They could access that with a search warrant. But now people are able to do things online that the government can't access. And this also changed the behaviour of countries towards each other. Now, if they want to find out a country's secrets, they don't send spies to that country to break into their files, their paper files. Now they need to access their computer systems. Russia got a head start on that. They began that work in 1996. 1989 to 1991. They're already known in this movement. This is our increase of knowledge. It's a period of time. It's the fall of the Soviet Union, and it's the invention of the World Wide Web. All of these things are a period of time. 1996 is at a waymark on our reform line, the formalization of our message. And we see another development in this information age. In 1996, you had the first major attack against the American government computers. This first major attack on October 7 of 1996 was when a computer operator in a Colorado School of Mines discovered computer activity on their company computers that he couldn't explain. This is just a minor school in Colorado, but this minor school had contracts with the United States Navy. They warned the Navy that their computers were showing some signs of strange behaviour, but no one could understand what was going on. For 2 years, investigators tracked this strange behaviour, and what was happening was that Russia had, through this small school, accessed computers belonging to the United States Navy, to the Department of Energy, to the United States Air Force, and NASA. In the end, they concluded that the total number of computer files that Russia had stolen, if they were stacked, would be taller than the Washington Monument. What Russia accessed was American weapons designs. What they accessed was information. And they titled this hacking, they gave it a name, Moonlight Maze. It has been said that the world changed with Moonlight Maze. This began a whole different way of interacting, of antagonistic behaviour. This was a cyber attack, but again, it's about information. The next waymark on our reform line is 9/11. The United States was facing some difficulty prior to this history, knowing how to work with this new information system of computers and the World Wide Web. And the government secret agencies, the FBI and the CIA, had been trying to get Congress to pass laws that enabled them to track the behaviour of their citizens online. This attempt to access the private information of US citizens had been repeatedly denied by Congress. But in September 11, when those Twin Towers go down and there's a terrorist attack, Congress is frightened. The whole of the United States is terrified. And what the laws that they had previously not been able to get through, they passed 45 days after 9/11. This was the Patriot Act. When George Bush signed the Patriot Act into law 45 days after 9/11, he said the following: "Surveillance of communication is an essential tool to pursue and stop terrorists." He says, "The existing law was written in the era of rotary telephones. This new law, the Patriot Act, that I signed today will allow the surveillance of all communications used by terrorists, including emails, the internet, and cell phones." What they're able to pass at 9/11 under the Patriot Act is government surveillance of the information people share via the World Wide Web. It's hard to think of what can go on in the United States when we consider it to be like a pillar of democracy. But when you hear what their law enforcement agencies are able to do, it's a little bit horrifying. In Australia, the police would not get away with what the United States police force gets away with doing. For example, if you're traveling along a highway in the United States and a police officer pulls you over and he searches your car for no reason and he finds that you have some money in your car, he can say without any proof, "You have that money because you're going to buy drugs." And then he can confiscate that money for you, take it back to his police station and pool it, and they can essentially buy each other office presents. There is no proof required. All he has to do is suspect that maybe you are going to do something illegal with that money. And then if you want that money back, you have to go to the same people that took that money from you and prove to them that you weren't going to do anything wrong with that money. This has been much more serious when they've then had police officers turn up at your door and say, your son has been selling drugs out of your house, now we're taking your house. So what can go on within the United States, which we understand as this democracy, is sometimes, even for you and I, a little bit seriously horrifying. And under the Patriot Act, this gave the United States government surveillance of its private citizens. I don't want to go through all of the different aspects of that Patriot Act. They are interesting, the way that they can say that a terrorist, as we saw, George Bush said this was to monitor terrorists, but in the Patriot Act, the definition of a terrorist is an enemy of the state. So it's anyone that they think opposes the government. And they've used that definition before. In an internal investigation in those agencies, the US agencies of the FBI and the CIA, in an internal investigation, they came to the conclusion that under the Patriot Act, they had not stopped a single terrorist attack since 2001. What they had done was take down a whole lot of other people, whether they were drug dealers or financial fraud, many other things, but never a terrorist, under what we would define as a terrorist. Now they can go into your property. If we were in the United States now and we were off this property, they would be able to come in, go through your house, search your things, without ever telling you were there and then leave again, without ever having to tell you that they had even been inside your property, let alone they were coming. They can then issue a national security letter and force your accountant or any business that you have ties to hand over all of your personal information without giving any reason for that. This is a direct violation of the US Constitution. And it's at this point, at 9/11 under the Patriot Act, we've already understood an attack on the Constitution that is progressive. And it relates to information because now they are a surveillance police state. Under the Constitution, they must receive court approval to undertake surveillance of their people. So what they have set up is what is known as the FISA court. This is a secret court set up to give these intelligence agencies approval to conduct searches on their citizens. And this FISA court was set up in 1979. In 1979, it begins operating. From 1979 to 2013, this is 34 years of history. How many approvals did this secret court give to search US citizens? Over 34 years, they accepted 35,434 government applications. In 34 years, how many did this secret court reject, where they said that the US government could not access your information? 12 times. Only 12 times did they reject government requests for information. Much of what happened, much of what this was set up to do was to allow surveillance of the internet. In 2006, George Bush signed into law a 4-year extension of the Patriot Act. This Patriot Act was only meant to be in place for 4 years, then it expired, and it would need to be signed into law again. And then 4 years after that, it would expire again. It was only on like a 4-year contract. So in 2006, George Bush signed it into another 4-year contract. In 2007, Operation PRISM began. And in 2007, it was interpreted that under the Patriot Act, they could now place backdoors where they could gather online data from search history, from contents of emails, pretty much backdoors to access the private information on Microsoft, Google, Yahoo, Facebook, YouTube, Apple, all these different computer networks. All that I'm wanting to suggest is that the Patriot Act ties into this information age, and it becomes again about the internet. The next waymark I want to mark is 2004. This is where we mark the beginning of the laying of the foundations. It was the government agencies like the CIA and the FBI that were wanting the Patriot Act passed. But what this really gave power to was the President of the United States. And in 2004, the President George Bush wanted to extend the Patriot Act, the powers of the Patriot Act, to be even more than they were at 9/11. At this point in time, he's stopped by the head of the FBI. He's blocked by two main men, two leaders inside the government, inside the FBI, pretty much blocked George Bush from being able to extend the Patriot Act any further. They recognized that what George Bush was calling for was not constitutional. The two men that step in and stop him, that block the President of the United States, was a man named James Comey and a man named Robert Mueller. In 2004, they stopped George Bush from being able to extend the powers of the Patriot Act. This is significant because in 2004, Comey and Mueller restrict the president. When we consider what is going on with Donald Trump today, these are the two men facing Donald Trump. James Comey, Donald Trump has already fired. He began really this looking into Donald Trump's dealings with Russia, and it's Robert Mueller that is at the moment heading the investigation, looking into whether or not there was collusion between Russia and Donald Trump back in this history. So these two men that restricted George W. Bush are the two men that have stood against Donald Trump and have been holding him back. In 2004, they were successful. They're not doing so well at the moment. James Comey has been fired and Donald Trump is threatening to fire Robert Mueller. And then we get to 2014. 2014, as you can see, each one of these is a waymark in our reform line. So is 2014. And what is 2014 for us? It's our Sunday law. It's our Sunday law. Where begins the loud cry that occurs before our close of probation? So where is the Sunday law in 2014? Thank you, that's a wonderful idea. We have covered 1989 to 91. It's a 2-year period of time, the development. Then we've seen 1996 and Russia come into the picture and cyber warfare and hacking. Then at 9/11 we see this attack on the United States Constitution, on the rights of American citizens. 2004 we see James Comey and Robert Mueller hold back George Bush, hold back the United States President. In 2004, we should expect to see a further breakdown of the Constitution, a further waymark in our line of information. I would suggest that to understand the external, we need to understand the internal. It's the internal that shows us, that gives us some idea of the external. So if we can consider what is happening internally in 2014 and then parallel it with the external, I think it opens up to us what 2014 was externally. In 2012, I will for the minute rub this out. In 2012, a message came to this movement, and it came out of England. There's a message. Technically it came out of Wales, which doesn't consider itself England, and I get in trouble, so I'm going to say it came out of Britain. A message came out of Britain, and it entered the United States. What this message was about was that it was predicting 2014 would be a Sunday law. How was that message received? It was rejected. The message was hindered on 2 fronts. First of all was the rejection of the leadership. It was rejected by the leaders and called fanaticism. And then in 2013, I would suggest linked to that rejection, you also see enemies emerging from the inside. This is path of the just, etc. These enemies begin to show themselves in 2013, and it really culminates in 2014 with a total split. But they show themselves for what they are in 2013. These are the 2 problems facing an internal message that was designed to prepare us for our Sunday law. Rejection by the leadership and the enemies working from the inside. So when we consider then the external, this is the internal. If we can consider the external, 2012, what I want to look at tomorrow, and if we could consider, was the idea that whatever came that affected the US Constitution in 2014, what violated the rights of its citizens, came out of Britain in 2012 and entered the United States. The problem was that just like the internal, this did not come from the leadership of the United States, and that's why it's been so hard for some time for us to understand the external of 2014. We don't see Obama do anything in 2014, but we also didn't see a message from our leadership in 2014 either. It doesn't come from the leadership, it comes out of England. It's rejected by the leadership and it faces internal enemies. If you're going to see a violation of the Constitution, it hit a serious hurdle in 2013 with Edward Snowden. Edward Snowden was a private contractor working for the NSA. That's the NSA is that secret US government branch, agency. What he did was he took the largest collection of top secret documents ever gathered in history and then released them through WikiLeaks. This was the largest leak of top secret documents ever in history. And what Edward Snowden leaked was everything that the US government had been doing under the Patriot Act. So now US citizens know what the government, how the government has been spying on them since 2001. These leaks were directly related to the Patriot Act and that history of surveillance. It was the greatest attack on the Patriot Act since it was first put in place at 9/11. It showed how the government had accessed private emails, phone records, and what the government had done was that they had decided that to stay safe, instead of just taking what they needed, that they would bulk collect everyone. So every email sent by every single person inside the United States for those years was collected by the government, placed in one central database to be accessed as needed. So if you sent an email in the United States in that history, it was beyond a doubt in a government database. This is what Snowden started to show. Where is Snowden hiding today? Russia. Because the United States government would love to get their hands on him. He's very safe inside of Russia. Snowden said that the reason he acted was that he understood that the mass surveillance programs done under the Patriot Act would not withstand a constitutional challenge. They violated the US Constitution, and that the public deserved a chance to see these issues determined in an open court. So we can see the internal and the external start to have a play in this history. 2014, though, was still a waymark for this reform line. It's still our Sunday law, so I would suggest when it comes to external events, we will still see that in that history, externally. But it looks different. It does not come from the leadership, and it was opposed by enemies from within. Edward Snowden, or in this case, those within the movement. Tomorrow we'll finish that. We're going to look at the internal and external again, and we're going to consider what that dynamic was and what occurred in 2014. If you'll kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, for all of our blessings. Lord, I pray, I know that my lips are often stumbling, but Lord, I just thank you and I praise you for helping us to understand what has been going on in these histories. Lord, you do not leave your people in ignorance. Father, I pray that we might gain further understanding, further clarity on these issues, Lord, and that we might come into that common understanding that unites us, that enables us to stand as an army. I pray, Lord, that you will help us as we strive to understand, and that we will see your hand in these things, and that we might also, as we look in these external things, also see your hand and your character. We see, Lord, the difference between your government and the government of the world, the difference between how you see a country run, and the difference is that that country takes the side of the counterfeit when it starts to work, Lord, for the papacy. We see that those histories under World War II, under Nazi Germany, Lord, they were the work of Satan, not the work of your hand. And we're grateful, Lord, that you are so kind and so loving to your people, that you love us so much, and that you wish us to be restored of our wounds in body and in mind. I pray, Lord, that you'll bless us as a fellowship, bless the community here, and may we all, Lord, rest well tonight and come together in the morning to praise you. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.